Everyone, it's Wednesday and it's time for our deep dive. And again, just thank you to everyone who's been watching and sharing these broadcasts. They are by far our most viewed broadcasts in recent weeks and months. And following last week's session on Gershwin, I was very much inspired by the fact that Gershwin almost became a preeminent composer of film music. Sadly, his untimely death put an end to that, but he could well have been an essential component in the golden age of film music. And it got me thinking, a lot of people love film music. There are entire YouTube channels and indeed radio stations devoted to sharing film music. There are increasing numbers of classical concerts that are comprised entirely of film music. But where did it all start? And I think for most people, it's sort of shrouded in mystery. I think most people can identify the silent movie era and can say, well, yes, pianists played, but why? How did it all start? Well, we're going to explore that today. And this is going to be the start of a 4-week series exploring the origins and particularly the classical origins of film music, because there's some really interesting and surprising information as we go through. And we'll be exploring some of the leaps and strides that the movie industry took from its early dabblings with sound to fully fledged soundtracks. But we start this week at the very beginning, before sound. And we need to start here with this machine. This is the kinetograph, as invented by the great Thomas Edison. And the first kinetoscope parlour opened in 1894. And you could pay a small amount, a cent or so, and turn the handle and watch a film. And these are very, very early films. At this point, I do need to let you know that quite a few of the more successful kinetographs were effectively peep shows. What we would call down here in the UK, what the butler saw. And these generated quite a lot of income and quite a lot of interest. Now, these were not particularly complicated machines. They worked on a system of, as I say, turning a handle, which flicked a series of images around and around, operated for not very much, and you peered in through the top. But it was revolutionary, entirely revolutionary. You could see an image moving in front of you, but limited. As I say, not just because you had to turn the handle yourself, but because you could only get one person watching at once. And often there were queues for these machines leading out of the building around the corner. Now, Thomas Edison didn't just deal in peep shows. He actually filmed some of the very earliest footage that we have. And here is actual footage of Annie Oakley, filmed in the 1890s by Thomas Edison himself. Have a look at this. Have to say, wouldn't want to be her assistant at this point. You have a lot of trust in your employer at that point. But it's remarkable to see Annie Oakley, for real, shooting clay pigeons filmed by Thomas Edison in the 1890s. But also to consider how vastly significant and yet how very basic this footage is. It's short. It's only a few seconds long. It's very grainy. It's black and white, obviously, and completely silent. And yet things would only improve from here. From these early beginnings, this was the worst it would ever be. Now, I need to introduce you to another very important figure in the development of early film. This is Antoine Lumière. And he had a photographic business in France in the 1890s. His sons, Auguste and Louis, who we'll meet in a moment, are very, very famous because they developed the very first cinematograph machines. But their father was responsible for a film camera business. At the age of 17, Louis Lumière developed a highly sensitive photographic plate, which the Lumière factory then began manufacturing en masse. And it was so successful commercially that the Lumières built a factory in the suburb of Lyon. And by the mid-1890s, they were employing 300 people. Now, here are the Lumière brothers. And you can definitely tell they're related to their father. Now, later in 1894, Antoine saw an example of Edison's peep show in Paris. And he encouraged his sons to devise an apparatus that would take and then project these moving pictures. Now, within a few months, the Lumière brothers developed a successful prototype of the cinematograph, which was not only a camera, but also a printer and a projector as well. It was patented in France in February of 1895, and this is what it looked like. And compared with other attempts at producing a movie camera, the cinematograph was remarkably compact. And unlike the Edison kinetograph, it could be transported around. It was small, it could be taken anywhere, and it could shoot film. It could also be used as a projector. And all that was required was a magic lantern lamp house with a gas or limelight illuminant. So it didn't need electricity, which some of Edison's kinetographs actually did in order to light the image. So the cinematograph was essential. And what we're about to see is one of the first films made by the Lumiere brothers. And this is called, as you can see, The Arrival of a Train at La Ciotat, and it was shot in 1896. And this movie changed the world. I just want to show it to you first of all, okay? And I want you all to just bear in mind you're perfectly safe as you watch this. Let's try that again. Don't panic, you're perfectly safe. Now you might be saying, why is he saying we're perfectly safe? Well, when these amazing scenes were first shown to the first paying audiences in the tents that the Lumiere brothers would set up as they travelled around to show this technology off, people would literally run screaming from the tent at that footage because they were scared that the train was going to hit them. This was so new, this was so revolutionary, and yet, of course, it would only develop and only get better. Here's a little bit more of Lumiere footage. These are workers leaving a factory in 1896. Isn't that absolutely amazing? Now, soon film production companies were being established all around the world, and the first decade of motion pictures saw film moving from a novelty to an established mass entertainment industry. Obviously, the earliest films were all in black and white, under a minute long, and without recorded sound. But what happened, of course, is that technology moved on, and during the 1890s, films became several minutes long. It started to consist of several shots, but there was a problem. The exhibitors of the earliest films soon realized that the projector was actually quite noisy, and combined with the silence of the film, limited the appeal to an audience. So, as the first film studios were being built in 1897, what film producers and film exhibitors needed was a way to cover the sound of the projector, also to cover the sound of an audience sitting there in absolute silence with signs up saying, "Be quiet, no shouting, no swearing, no spitting." And so what did they do? Well, they brought in musicians to provide background sound to cover the sound of the projector, the noise, but also to enhance the storytelling. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that although we are very much used to watching films now, in those early days, there was a lot of concern about film working as it does, where you get different scenes moving from one to the other with sudden cuts. And the very earliest films were single camera, single shot films like that film of Annie Oakley there, rather than what we see today where you might have a close-up, you might have a panning shot, you might have establishing shots and so on. The worry was that it would be far too confusing for people to follow if the scenes changed quickly. And so they were effectively filmed plays. And film, as a technological process, produces basically larger-than-life, two-dimensional, largely black and white silent images. For us as an audience, certainly for the audience back then, accepting this as reality requires a significant leap of faith. And so music it was brought in not just to cover the sound of the projector, but also to use its melody, its harmony, its instrumental colour, not to mention, of course, the presence of actual live musicians, will flesh out those images, will give them credibility and believability. And of course, music distracts audiences from the unnaturalness of the medium. Cuts and edits disappear as music smooths transitions from one scene and one emotion to another. And of course, music has been doing this at this point for centuries. Of course, when we go to see an opera, you go and see a play, there is background music, and that had been the case for as I say, for centuries. And this gives it that sense of believability. It takes you out of the real world and takes you into what you're looking at. Now, cinema owners would employ a wide range of musical strategies to differentiate their product because, of course, this was the new technology. Cinemas and, as you can see here, Nickelodeons exploded. Just they were everywhere. And during this Nickelodeon period, prior to 1910, the variety reached its zenith. Theatres often deployed interesting and competing different sound strategies, from carnival-style music in the street to automatic pianos in the rear of the theatre, sometimes even small orchestras in the pit, to lecturers, synchronized sound systems, and even voices, live voices behind the screen, pushing the dialogue in so that people got a sense of being involved in the film. Now, film music was largely live in the silent cinema, but its practice was somewhat specific to the cultures and nations where it was heard. In Japan, for example, when films were shown, movies featured a live narration, and this continued for quite a while throughout the silent period, well into the 1930s. In the United States, sometimes phonograph recordings were used in early film exhibition, but one of the issues was, of course, that the music, well, often couldn't react to what was going on screen, and sometimes it just didn't gel. Now, musically, essentially, and this is one of the key aspects to understanding the origins of film music, live music drew its inspiration from 19th century stage melodramas. Why? Well, this was the language that people understood. People at this point hadn't seen many films, but they'd all been to the theatre, they'd all seen opera, they'd all seen what we now think of as musicals. And so the style of the music was, of course, 19th century. And so people drew on that musical tradition to accompany what was there on screen. And the first musicians to really perform regularly to film were pianists. And why? Well, to be honest, pianos were ubiquitous. They were, as Sir Thomas Beecham said, often to be found adhering to the wall of most middle-class houses. Everyone played the piano. You could have a large room-filling sound, and you only have to pay one musician. It also takes up far less space than an orchestra, and as there were no guidelines at the time as to what pieces could be played, vitally these pianists used their repertoire of Western classical pieces and often improvised to fit the mood of the film. And you can't improvise as an orchestra, but you absolutely can as a pianist. One of the issues, however, was that the quality of the playing and the quality of the performing varied hugely between pianists and therefore between theatres. More on that later. Now, this variety of styles and this variety of music led to the formation of a new kind of language, the use of flexible musical styles to accompany moving images. And this was something that hadn't happened before. We were used to the idea of music suggesting action, and we'll talk very shortly about programmatic music, which have been around for decades, if not centuries. But this was the first time that music had to follow the action rather than the action being set to the music, as in a ballet or an opera. This time the music had to be subservient to what was being shown on screen, and this presented a unique challenge. But before we look at how they got round that, let's talk briefly about programmatic music. And I've mentioned this on the channel many, many times before, and it goes all the way back to the Baroque era, if not earlier. And this chap here, who we know very well, we spoke about him just a few weeks ago, Mr. Vivaldi, made famous use of programmatic techniques throughout his music, most notably in the Four Seasons, those concertos for violin, where we hear within the music the buzzing of bees. We hear a cuckoo. Here's an example. So you have cuckoo, cuckoo. You also have, here's another example of the calling of birds. This is all programmatic music, where the music is telling us a story. And this continued through the Baroque era. Beethoven had a go. Of course, if you know his Sixth Symphony, it's full of programmatic elements. You've got a walk in the countryside, you've got a peasant festival, a huge storm, and in the second movement, this beautiful babbling brook. Now, into the Romantic era, we see a huge explosion in programmatic music. Prior to the 19th century, you could hide programmatic elements in your classical music, but it was rather looked down upon. It was sneered at. It was seen as cheap. But of course, by the time the 19th century comes along, well, you're trying to create an emotional state in the listener that is much more flexible, that is much more about creating a sense of emotion and a sense of place. And so one of the key figures in early programmatic writing is dear Felix Mendelssohn, whose writing was both clever and aimed at painting these clear pictures in people's minds when they heard it. If you consider, for example, the Hebrides Overture, where you've got the rising waves that crash on the huge rocks, you've got the heavy use of angst-ridden diminished sevenths in The Fire Descends from Heaven from Elijah. He even has the donkey in The Midsummer Night's Dream. Let's have a listen to a couple of examples. Here's the donkey. It's not exactly subtle. And here's that example from the Hebrides Overture. Listen to the waves rising and crashing. Pulling back, and a big wave. So you can see here these programmatic elements, these elements that give you clear pictures in your mind, are baked into the music of the 19th century. And composers such as Berlioz, you can see here, he wrote music that could be used for film long before film had been invented. His March to the Scaffold from Symphonie Fantastique has been used in dozens of films since its composition in the early 19th century. And I suppose these programmatic techniques just became ubiquitous as composers liberated from the shackles of the Baroque era, which was really quite obsessed with the rules and the regulations of music. They broke free and began experimenting with new sound worlds to create clear pictures in our minds, almost paving the way for film. And composers like Wagner and Mahler, as you can see here, they would take these programmatic threads and weave them into the first truly flexible and really human expressions of music. And I just want, before we go back to our film presentation, I just want you to consider the human emotional state. How long and how often can you just maintain one emotion? Honestly, 10 seconds, a minute, 5 minutes? If you bear in mind that the Baroque era gave us music that was stretched out, you would have effectively one emotion. This is the sad movement. This is the joyous movement. This is the angry movement. And the idea that you would maintain this emotional state for this length of time is actually genuinely quite difficult. Sometimes in the more advanced years of the Baroque era, you might get two emotions if you're lucky. But for the most part, Baroque music was tied to one emotional state per movement. Classical music brought in more extreme swings, so you would go sad to happy all of a sudden, and then back you'd go loud to quiet, but very little subtlety. It's almost as if the classical composers are going, right, you can have some emotions, but two, that's enough, no more. By the time you get to the Romantic era, what you're seeing is a more close mirror of the emotional flow of a human mind and the way that a mind will wander sometimes. Sometimes within 5 seconds, you might have several different emotions all on top of each other. And that is how the Romantic composers were exploring music. By the time you get to Mahler, you will have slow, quick, loud, soft, angry, gentle, wandering and focused, all within the space of a few bars. And so the music of the Romantic era is exactly what you needed to draw on in the early days of film music. Now, back to the silent world of film in the early days of the art form. What we started to see with all this variation in music and musical stylings, and in particular quality of music, the film industry began to get a bit worried, because we started to see with the quality slipping, started to see different cinemas doing well and others not so. If you knew that there was a particularly good pianist at one cinema, that cinema would do very well, whereas the cinema down the road where the pianist was playing with their elbows, they weren't doing so well. So the US film industry in particular began to standardize musical accompaniment around about 1908, thereabouts. This is the same period that saw film really solidify as a narrative form, and the conversion of viewing spaces from small, cramped Nickelodeons to large and increasingly large theatrical auditoriums. And upgrading the musical accompaniment was essential to this. Now, at this point, you started to see, and I love this kind of thing. You started to see pieces that were being written specifically for film, and these are the very, very first bits of music. You can see here, this is called Misterioso, in brackets, for depicting stealth, murder, gruesome scenes, etc. And this is a piano conductor score, and the music sounds a little bit like this. So that is an example of the kind of music that would go underneath a stealthy scene, or as you can see, I'm not sure it would necessarily go well with murder, but, you know, times change. Now, we might also see another example of something a bit more agitated, such as this agitato. Again, suited for gruesome or infernal scenes such as witches, etc. So this is agitato number 3 by Otto Lange. And those of you who were saying at the very start, you know, this kind of music sounds like someone has tied a heroine to the train tracks and the evil villain is standing above twiddling his moustache. I think this is exactly the kind of music we're talking about. So you get the idea, and you might be surprised to know that these pieces were written down. Originally, of course, they weren't. You would have a pianist turn up with a bundle of music under their arm, and they would improvise, they would use pieces and so on. But what we started to see here in the early days of the 20th century is a standardization, and a sense that you would play from this repertoire to enhance the film. And books of piano music were published with scenes specifically written for certain moods or genres. And some of the later volumes were very sophisticated, such as this amazing book by Erno Rappe. It's called Motion Picture Moods. It was published in 1924. And books like this were designed to be played along with music, along with movies, and for the pianist to rapidly turn between pieces as the mood changed. And you'll love this. Motion Picture Moods included a directory of moods at the side of the page to help with this. Before we have a look at it, we need to meet Erno Rappe. You can tell that this picture was taken in the 1920s because, well, let's just say the fashion for that particular moustache disappeared sometime around the 1930s. But he was a Hungarian-born American symphonic conductor whose prolific career spanned both classical and popular music. He was a virtuoso pianist, but he is particularly known for his work in developing the early film scores. He supervised film scores for sound pictures and compiled a substantial list of films in which he worked as composer, arranger, and musical director. And this is what I mean in terms of his book. Can you see here, just at the side, next to the music, you have a series of themes, a series of genres. Aeroplane, page 2. As we go down, Children, page 31. Grotesque, page 165, Joyfulness, page 202. So the pages are marked clearly with the underlying emotions of a scene. So if the scene suddenly changed, the pianist could swiftly change pages to get the right sound for the visual. Now, of course, when you first started doing this, it might be a bit clunky, but pianists, being ever so clever and resourceful people, became very adept at this task, with many being ultimately able to play without reference materials, having performed along with the film so many times that they'd memorized the various pieces. And it's fair to say that playing along with films is truly a lost art. People have a go at it these days, but they can't hold a candle to the very, very early days and working with books like Motion Picture Moods. Now, we've seen some examples of music that was produced specifically for the films, but of course these books also drew upon the music of the 19th century. They made use of existing pieces of piano music written by famous composers and used them to illustrate particular scenes. Pieces like this bit of Grieg here, which falls into the humorous category. Have a listen to this. So you can hear why that piece was chosen. And what I find fascinating about these particular books and motion picture moods is probably the best of all of them. Although you'll see very many famous names of composers as you go through, you will not find any famous or well-known melodies. And there's a very good reason for that. This is to avoid the music distracting from the visuals. Because if a tune comes up, let's say they decided to use Beethoven's Fifth or even a bit of Vivaldi or something, that would distract because people would know the tune, they might start humming along, and that would take them out of the atmosphere that was trying to be created. And this led to a technique which is used today, which is the technique of underscoring. And more of that next week. But the idea is that you don't distract the audience by playing something that they know, you just provide an atmosphere. Now, before we finish, I'd just like you to consider the effect of adding some of these moods from motion picture moods to one of the films that was produced at the time. And this is a film produced in 1898 by the legendary French director and auteur Georges Méliès. Now, as we play it, I'm going to start and stop various pieces. We're going to start with that Grieg, then we'll add the Misterioso, and we might finish with the Agitato, and just note a couple of things as we do. Note as we listen how the feel of the film is changed. Although it is completely silent, the atmosphere of the film changes completely as the music shifts underneath it. Also notice how the film will suddenly seem to synchronize with the music, despite it starting at various random intervals. Let's see how we go. So we're going to start off. Let's start this wonderful, very silly film. Here's the Misterioso. Okay, now let's try Agitato. And lastly, the Grieg. You see, it's absolutely incredible how just a little bit of music will change the emotion, will change the feel of a piece. You can even create tension that isn't there by playing tense music over something fairly innocuous. So this shows the power of music and the power of the musician in front of the screen. Now, ultimately, that power was going to be taken away from the musicians who were playing live, because movie studios became tired of the variation in presentation and began standardizing the presentation for the movies, taking control of the sounds that went along with their pictures for the very first time. Now, this would require a new kind of music, one that evoked emotions, a sense of place, a sense of time, but was carefully crafted to match exactly the scenes and flow of a film. And this had never been done before. Now, obviously, the execs at these movie studios needed composers. So they looked around and, well, the composers that were working in Hollywood at the time, many of them were immigrants, many of them were Jewish immigrants who had come over from Eastern Europe and from Russia and what is now Ukraine. And they, of course, were trained in the Western classical tradition, in particular the music of the German Romantics. So a new age was about to dawn. the specially composed film score. And we will look at that next week as we continue our exploration of this fascinating topic. We'll look at the first orchestral scores and the rise of a new breed of composer, those who write specifically for film. So join me next Wednesday for the next thrilling instalment. It's a bit of a cliffhanger, I do grant you, of the classical origins of film music. So I hope you've enjoyed today. If you have, do please hit the like button. Do share this with anyone you think would appreciate learning about this fascinating subject. And join me next week as we welcome the mighty Wurlitzer and orchestras to discover what happened next in the classical origins of film music, part 2. Thanks so much, everyone. Look forward to seeing you soon. Please, if you wouldn't mind picking up your litter after you, fold your seat back up, and do bear in mind it might be a bit bright outside when you exit the auditorium, but otherwise, have a good day. See you soon. Bye-bye.